Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable: beauty, or more specifically, how the ancient Egyptians approached beauty in ways that were far stranger, more elaborate, and sometimes more dangerous than we could imagine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Forget what you think you know about ancient Egypt. While history books often focus on pharaohs and pyramids, there's a hidden, utterly captivating world of beauty rituals waiting to be unearthed. Get ready to discover the surprising, sometimes bizarre, lengths Egyptians went to look their best. It's a side of their civilization you won't believe. In the Egypt you think you know, the sun beats down on endless dunes, and the great monuments stand like frozen gods. In the Egypt you don't, the heat still beats down, but behind shaded walls and perfumed doorways, men and women are standing before polished bronze mirrors, carefully painting their eyes until they are rimmed in the deep black of kohl. This was not a fleeting fashion statement. It was part cosmetic, part protective charm, and part medical necessity. The kohl, made from ground galena or malachite mixed with animal fats or plant oils, created that signature elongated cat, a look that seems almost modern. To the Egyptians, though, it was much more than decoration. They believed it shielded them from the evil eye, warded off malicious spirits, and even protected them from the glare of the desert sun. The truth is, they were right about at least one thing: the lead salts in kohl actually killed bacteria, making it an early infection prevention tool. And this wasn't limited to women. Men painted their eyes just as carefully. In a culture where personal appearance was tied directly to status, order, and divine favor, grooming wasn't optional. It was part of living in harmony with Ma'at, the cosmic balance. It didn't stop with the eyes. Lips and cheeks were tinted with crushed red ochre mixed into ointments, sometimes with dangerously toxic minerals like cinnabar. Looking good could slowly kill you, but the ideal shade was worth the risk. Even fingernails were tinted with henna, a reddish-orange dye that signaled health and vitality. Hair, too, was an art form. Many Egyptians shaved their heads entirely to keep cool and avoid lice, replacing natural hair with wigs woven from human hair or plant fibers. Wigs could be perfumed, braided, or decorated with gold ornaments, and for special occasions, a cone of scented wax might be placed atop the head. As the evening wore on, it melted, releasing fragrance through the hair or wig, luxurious and faintly absurd. Perfume itself was an obsession. The wealthy stored thick, long-lasting scents in alabaster jars, blending myrrh, lotus, cinnamon, and frankincense into unguents that could last for months. Scent was more than seduction. It was believed to attract divine favor and repel illness. To smell bad was not merely unpleasant, it was spiritually dangerous. The skin, assaulted daily by desert heat, was protected with creams made from honey, milk, and animal fat. Honey's antibacterial properties made it a favored ingredient, while milk was thought to soften and rejuvenate the skin. Cleopatra, whether by truth or legend, was said to bathe in milk, an image so enduring that it's now impossible to separate the myth from the marketing. They even practiced exfoliation, using ground pumice or sea salt to scrub away dead skin, and applied skin lightening pastes containing white lead. The pursuit of beauty sometimes came with invisible cost. What's striking is that beauty wasn't gendered in the modern sense. Men took as much care with their appearance as women, and children were oiled, perfumed, and adorned from an early age. This wasn't vanity. It was survival, social display, and spiritual duty rolled into one. So when you imagine ancient Egypt, don't just think of the pharaoh on his golden throne. Picture instead the morning rituals. Someone grinding malachite into powder, another heating oil to infuse it with cinnamon, someone else gently combing out a wig. These were acts of care, identity, and faith, the small, daily luxuries that have kept humanity endlessly fascinated with the beauty secrets of the past. In the ancient Egyptian mind, the scent of a person was not just a pleasant detail, it was an aura, a signal, an offering. Smell could define your social worth as much as your clothing or your jewelry. To smell sweet and rich was to declare yourself civilized, blessed, and perhaps just a little closer to the gods. To smell foul was a sign of disorder, disease, and moral failing. It was not an exaggeration to say that perfume could make or break you. Perfume in Egypt was not the delicate, fleeting spray we think of today. It was dense, almost oily, designed to cling to the skin and endure through the heat of the day. These perfumes were made from fat or oil infused with resins, flowers, and spices. Myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, cardamom, lotus, and henna were popular ingredients, but they were not all local. The Egyptians imported rare aromatics from as far away as Punt, a semi-mythical land on the Red Sea coast that was, in many ways, their version of a luxury mall. The recipes for these perfumes were closely guarded, often held within temple walls. Priests would craft scents for religious rites, blending resins that, when burned or worn, were said to please the gods. But these same sacred fragrances were also worn by the living for purely personal pleasure. The divine and the decadent were often one and the same. And then there was Kifi, the most famous Egyptian perfume of them all. It was not simply a cosmetic, it was a ritual. The preparation of Kifi could take days, even weeks, involving as many as 16 ingredients. It blended wine, raisins, honey, myrrh, juniper, cinnamon, and more into a paste that was rolled into balls or shaped into cones. Burned at night, its scent was believed to aid sleep, ease breathing, and invite pleasant dreams. Worn on the skin, it whispered of wealth and mystique. For the wealthiest Egyptians, perfume cones were the ultimate sensory accessory. Imagine attending a banquet in the flickering light of oil lamps, wearing a tall cone of perfumed wax atop your head. As the hours passed, the cone softened, melting slowly into your hair or wig, releasing a steady stream of fragrance. The effect was intoxicating, part practicality, part theatrical performance. Perfume wasn't just for the living. The dead were anointed with aromatic oils during mummification, their wrappings layered with resin and fragrant gums to preserve them for eternity. In some cases, perfume jars were buried alongside the deceased, as though the soul might need to refresh itself on the long journey to the afterlife. Scent was a companion across worlds. There's also an unspoken truth about ancient Egyptian perfume culture. It was as much about status as seduction. Scent marked you as someone who could afford luxuries imported from far-off lands. A whiff of cinnamon didn't just mean you smelled nice. It meant you had the wealth and connections to possess something that had traveled hundreds of miles, carried across deserts and seas. Even the act of applying perfume was ceremonial. Oils were poured from alabaster jars into the palm or onto a bronze applicator, then smoothed across the body with slow, deliberate movements. This was not a hurried dab at the wrist. It was a full-body ritual, a sensory indulgence layered onto the already elaborate grooming habits of the day. And yet, as luxurious as these perfumes were, they also carried the weight of superstition. Certain scents were believed to ward off evil spirits or protect against illness. Myrrh, for example, was prized for both its fragrance and its supposed power to drive away disease. Frankincense was thought to purify the air, an early aromatic form of hygiene. In a way, perfume was ancient Egypt's invisible crown. You might not see it, but you knew it was there, radiating power and intention. It clung to the skin, wove itself into the fabric of linen garments, and even lingered on the air long after its wearer had left. To the Egyptians, that lingering presence was not a coincidence. It was a legacy, a little like a monument in scent form. When we think about beauty, we often think about what can be seen: painted eyes, styled hair, gold jewelry. But in ancient Egypt, beauty was as much about what you could smell as what you could see. And perhaps that's why the civilization's love affair with perfume has endured in our imagination. It is the most ephemeral of luxuries, and yet somehow, it has managed to outlast the centuries. To a modern observer, Egyptian makeup is often reduced to a visual stereotype: dark, almond-shaped eyes lined with kohl, lips tinted a deep red, cheeks brushed with mineral color. But in its own time, makeup was not merely decoration. It was protection, it was medicine, it was a whispered spell carried on the skin. The Egyptians painted their eyes not just to look beautiful, but to guard against 1,000 invisible enemies. Kohl, that black, silky line framing the eyes, was crafted from ground galena or stibnite mixed with fat or oil. On the surface, it gave the gaze a striking, otherworldly power, elongating the eye into the shape of the falcon, the symbol of Horus. But underneath, it was a kind of daily armor. The mineral compounds in kohl helped reflect the sun's glare, protecting the eyes from the blinding desert light. And more than that, they killed bacteria, warding off eye infections in a world without antibiotics. For the Egyptians, this wasn't accidental science. It was a deliberate blend of beauty and health. You weren't just adorning yourself, you were shielding yourself. Each sweep of the applicator was a choice to walk through life protected by both aesthetics and alchemy. Eyeshadow, too, was more than color. The famous green pigment, made from ground malachite, was associated with rebirth and fertility. Wearing it wasn't simply a nod to fashion, it was an invocation, a call to the gods for vitality and renewal. Blue pigments, often made from crushed lapis lazuli or synthetic Egyptian blue, linked the wearer to the heavens, the Nile, and the life-giving floods. In other words, to wear blue was to wear the very essence of creation. Lips and cheeks, meanwhile, were stained with mixtures of red ochre and animal fat. The fat helped the pigment stick in the heat and dryness of the climate, and in some cases, the mixture included ingredients meant to ward off disease. Beauty was never a superficial game in Egypt. It was functional, layered with meaning and precaution. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Egyptian cosmetics was how deeply they were tied to magic. Applying makeup could be a ritual act, invoking deities for protection. The Eye of Horus, a symbol representing healing and restoration, was painted not just on temples and tombs, but echoed in the very shape of the eyeliner worn by men and women alike. To wear that shape was to carry a protective amulet directly on your face. And yes, men wore makeup, and not just the elite. In fact, in the ancient Egyptian mindset, it was entirely natural for everyone, regardless of gender, to use cosmetics. The goal was not vanity in the modern sense. It was order, harmony, protection, the principles the Egyptians called ma'at. The tools of the trade were objects of beauty themselves: polished bronze mirrors, intricately carved applicator sticks, and small alabaster jars with narrow necks to hold precious pigments. Some applicators were shaped like animals or gods, turning the act of painting one's face into an offering in miniature. Even the palettes used to grind pigments were decorated, often with images of lotus flowers, fish, or sacred symbols. And then there were the less savory truths. Some cosmetic recipes included ingredients that were toxic in large amounts. Prolonged use of lead-based kohl could cause health problems over time, though the antibacterial benefits probably saved far more eyes than it harmed. It's a reminder that beauty, then as now, often comes with a price, one the Egyptians were fully willing to pay. Cosmetics were so valued that they were buried with the dead. Archaeologists have found makeup kits in tombs, complete with pigments still vibrant after thousands of years. A queen or noblewoman was expected to arrive in the afterlife as perfectly adorned as she had been in life, eyes darkened, cheeks flushed, lips painted, ready to face eternity in style. To dismiss ancient Egyptian makeup as mere ornament is to miss its essence entirely. It was a survival tool, a talisman, a medicine, a social signal, and a bridge to the divine. Every line drawn, every color chosen, was part of a much larger story, a story in which the human body became a sacred canvas, painted daily in devotion to both life and the gods. In the heat of Egypt, hair was never just hair. It was status, it was fashion, it was a signal broadcast in braids and curls and carefully chosen scents. And often, it wasn't even your own. The most iconic Egyptian hairstyles you see in museum displays, those intricate braids, elaborate curls, and thick, glossy locks, were usually wigs. Human hair wigs were prized, often blended with fibers from palm leaves or sheep's wool to create volume and shape. Wigs could be towering, ornate creations, or simple bob-like cuts, depending on the era and the wearer's taste. But in all cases, they were crafted with precision. The wealthy might own several, switching styles to suit the occasion, just as someone today might choose between formal wear and casual clothes. For the elite, wigs were a necessity, not a luxury. The climate was too hot, lice too common, and the demands of beauty too high to leave hair to its natural devices. Many Egyptians, men and women alike, shaved their heads entirely, wearing wigs not only for style but for hygiene. Without natural hair, lice had nowhere to hide, and without lice, one could perfume the head freely without fear of infestation. The perfume was its own story. Wigs were often scented with cones of fragrant wax, shaped like small domes and perched on top of the head. Made from animal fat and infused with myrrh, cinnamon, or lotus oil, these cones slowly melted in the heat of the day, releasing fragrance that clung to hair and skin. By evening, the scent was woven into the very fibers of the wig, a lasting mark of luxury and refinement. Of course, not everyone could afford human hair wigs perfumed with imported resins. The less wealthy made do with wigs of plant fibers or animal hair. They might be coarser, heavier, and less convincing, but they served the same purposes, shielding the scalp from the sun, hiding baldness or lice, and conforming to the cultural ideal that a well-presented head was a sign of respectability. The shapes and styles changed over centuries. In the Old Kingdom, wigs were often simple, short bobs with straight edges. By the New Kingdom, styles became more extravagant, long, layered locks cascading over shoulders, with tiny braids framing the face. Some wigs were adorned with gold beads, ribbons, or in rare cases, actual gold wire woven into the strands. The most important wearers could turn their hair into a piece of jewelry, catching the light with every movement. And wigs were not only for women. Men of high status wore them too, from shoulder-length waves to shorter, military-style cuts. Priests often shaved their heads completely for ritual purity but might don a wig for formal occasions. Even children were subject to these beauty codes. Young boys of noble families might have their heads shaved save for one long lock, a style that signaled youth and divine favor. In life, wigs were a social marker. In death, they were a necessity. Tomb paintings show the deceased adorned with perfect hair, whether natural or crafted, and actual wigs have been found placed carefully alongside mummies. To face the gods in the afterlife without proper hair would have been unthinkable. It would have been arriving underdressed to eternity. But wigs were also practical in a way that modern fashion rarely is. They could be swapped out when worn, cleaned, or restyled. In a land where the sun baked everything and sand crept into every crevice, a detachable hairpiece was easier to maintain than natural locks. The use of wigs also intersected with law and religion. Certain ceremonial roles required specific hairstyles. Priests of particular gods might wear distinctive cuts or shaven heads, while mourners at funerals sometimes wore long, disheveled wigs as part of their ritual grief. In these contexts, hair was a prop in a larger performance, a way to embody the mood or duty of the day. And like all things Egyptian, hair was tied to the gods. The goddess Hathor, patron of beauty and joy, was often depicted with a thick mane of hair adorned with ornaments. To emulate her was to align oneself with divine beauty, a subtle yet powerful statement. Today, when we see an ancient Egyptian wig in a glass display case, it's easy to think of it as a relic of style. But in its own time, it was far more than fashion. It was a shield, a social passport, and sometimes a portable altar to beauty itself. Every strand, whether human, plant, or wool, was part of a larger story about how the Egyptians constructed identity, one braid at a time. If hair was the crown, scent was the invisible robe, the final, lingering mark of beauty in ancient Egypt. In a land where the air was thick with heat and the river carried the scent of life and decay in equal measure, fragrance wasn't just pleasant. It was protection, a lure, and in some cases, a prayer. Egyptians didn't merely dab on perfume. They bathed in it, anointed themselves with it, burned it, and in some cases, wore it like a slow-burning candle on their heads. The most iconic example is the mysterious perfume cone, a small, waxy dome placed atop wigs or natural hair during banquets, festivals, and formal occasions. Made from animal fat mixed with precious oils, the cone would slowly soften in the day's heat, releasing streams of scent that mingled with the body's own warmth. By evening, the wearer was steeped in fragrance, a living cloud of luxury. Perfume was an industry. Egypt's climate was perfect for growing aromatic plants like myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, and lotus, and what couldn't be grown locally was imported. Punt, a faraway land along the Red Sea coast, was famous for its aromatic treasures, and pharaohs organized expeditions just to bring back shiploads of resin, oils, and exotic woods. These weren't just for temples, they were for the boudoirs of the elite. The lotus flower was a favorite, not just for its sweet, heady scent, but for its symbolism. Closing at night and blooming again with the sun, the lotus embodied rebirth. To smell of lotus was to carry a piece of eternity on your skin. Incense made from kifi, a blend of herbs, honey, raisins, and wine, was another staple. It was burned in homes, temples, and even aboard boats, driving away insects and, according to belief, evil spirits. Oils were more than carriers of fragrance. They were medicine for the skin in a land where the sun showed no mercy. Daily anointing kept the skin supple, prevented cracking, and softened the signs of age. Wealthy Egyptians kept jars of scented oils in alabaster, decorated with carved lotuses or the heads of gods. The poor used simpler mixtures of animal fat and local herbs, applied with the same devotion, if not the same opulence. Perfume was also a currency of seduction. Love poems from the New Kingdom are laced with references to fragrance. A lover smelling of myrrh, skin gleaming with oil. To be perfumed was to be desirable, and an unwashed, unscented body was more than just impolite. It was socially dangerous. A whiff of neglect could undo your reputation faster than a poorly chosen outfit. Religion gave fragrance its deepest meaning. Temples burned incense to carry prayers to the gods, the smoke rising like a divine messenger. The same scents used in worship were often worn by priests and priestesses, linking the body to the sacred. It blurred the line between personal beauty and holy ritual. To smell like a temple was to hint at divinity. Perfume also followed Egyptians to the grave. Tombs contained alabaster jars still holding traces of ancient scent. These weren't symbolic gestures. The belief was that the dead would need fragrance in the afterlife just as much as the living did in banquets. The gods, it was assumed, had noses, and pleasing them was simply good sense. Even the making of perfume had an air of sorcery. Recipes were guarded secrets, passed from perfumer to apprentice. Some blends required aging, others ritual preparation under certain moon phases. Perfume making was chemistry with a dash of magic, a craft that blurred the lines between beauty, medicine, and religion. Today, when we think of perfume, we imagine a spritz from a glass bottle. But for the Egyptians, it was a daily ritual of transformation. It could turn sweat into a lure, protect skin from the sun, soothe the spirit, and signal status without a word spoken. In its own way, perfume was as powerful as a crown, and in a land where scent was sacred, to be fragrant was to be unforgettable. In the portraits that survive, their eyes still follow us. Dark, elongated, framed in bold lines that turn human faces into something otherworldly. To the ancient Egyptians, the eye wasn't merely an organ of sight. It was a symbol, a shield, and a signature. And the way they painted it was both beauty ritual and act of devotion. Kohl was the centerpiece. Made from ground galena, a dark, shimmering lead sulfide, it was mixed with animal fat or vegetable oil until it became a paste, then applied with a small stick or reed along the lashes and around the eyes, extending out toward the temples. The result was hypnotic, an almond shape that echoed the sacred eye of Horus, a protective symbol against evil spirits and the burning glare of the sun. This wasn't just aesthetics. The desert sun was relentless, and kohl acted like a primitive pair of sunglasses, reducing glare and shielding the eyes from infection. Modern studies suggest that lead-based kohl, in small doses, may have stimulated the immune system, helping ward off bacteria, a happy accident that kept eyes both beautiful and healthy. But it wasn't without risk. Prolonged use of lead compounds could be toxic, and there's a quiet possibility that in their pursuit of divine eyes, some Egyptians slowly poisoned themselves. The colors didn't stop at black. Green pigment made from malachite was favored in earlier periods, especially around 4000 BCE. It wasn't just a cosmetic choice. Green was tied to fertility, regeneration, and the lushness of the Nile's flood. To ring your eyes in green was to wear life itself, to signal renewal and good fortune. Blue pigments, derived from ground azurite or painstakingly crafted from Egyptian blue, the world's first synthetic pigment, were also used, especially in ceremonial contexts. Application was deliberate, almost meditative. Men wore kohl as much as women, and children often had their eyes lined too. Protection was for everyone. The elite kept their cosmetics in elaborately carved containers, often shaped like animals or gods, stored with small applicators that were as much art objects as tools. The poor might keep their pigment in simple clay pots, but the ritual of applying it was no less important. Makeup carried social meaning. To be seen without it was to appear unfinished, even vulnerable. In love poetry, lovers praised the painted eyes of their beloved, describing them as arrows to the heart. Priests painted their eyes before rituals, merging human vision with divine symbolism. Soldiers lined their eyes before going into battle, as much to honor the gods as to protect themselves from the desert glare. But kohl was also portable magic. The act of lining the eyes was tied to invoking the protection of Horus and Ra, gods whose eyes were powerful enough to defeat chaos itself. This meant that the morning beauty routine was, in its way, a sacred rite, as much about survival in the spiritual sense as in the physical. The palettes and jars that held kohl were treasures in their own right. Archaeologists have found them buried with the dead, still carrying traces of black and green powder after thousands of years. Some were made of ivory, others alabaster, their surfaces carved with hunting scenes or the faces of protective deities. Even in death, the journey through the afterlife demanded perfect eyes, both to charm and to see clearly in the world beyond. Modern makeup brands like to talk about timeless beauty, but here it is in the most literal sense. For 1,000 years later, the smoky, almond-shaped Egyptian eye remains iconic, a style resurrected on catwalks and in films, always with a faint echo of its original magic. In life, it warded off disease and ill fortune. In art, it made mortals look like gods. In memory, it has never truly faded. The Egyptians painted their eyes not because it was fashionable, but because it was powerful. And perhaps that's the secret Beauty that doubles as protection lasts far longer than beauty for its own sake. If the eyes were the windows to the soul, the skin was the canvas that told the rest of the story, and the ancient Egyptians believed that canvas should remain as smooth and luminous as polished limestone, no matter how many Niles you had seen in your lifetime. Their approach to skincare was startlingly sophisticated. In a land where the sun could wither fruit before it was ripe, protecting the skin wasn't vanity, it was survival. Daily rituals began with cleansing, often using a paste made from natron, a naturally occurring salt harvested from dry lake beds. Natron could strip oils, neutralize odors, and even disinfect, but it was harsh. To balance its drying effect, they followed with anointing, the most important part of the process. Oils were everywhere. Castor oil, morina oil, sesame oil, and almond oil were prized, each with its own texture and scent. These oils weren't poured from anonymous bottles. They were stored in slender alabaster jars, their narrow necks designed to release only a drop at a time, because luxury was measured in restraint. To apply them was an act of care and of status. The poor might have access to oil, but never in the quantities that dripped from the hands of the elite. The fragrances were intoxicating. Myrrh and frankincense, imported across scorching deserts, were mixed into salves, not just for scent but for their antibacterial properties. Lotus oil was especially beloved, infused with the blooms of the Nile's sacred flower until it carried the river's sweet, green perfume. Wrinkle prevention was serious business. Recipes recorded on papyrus mixed oil with ground fenugreek seeds, milk, and even animal fats. Honey, with its natural humectant properties, was blended into masks that kept the skin supple in the driest of seasons. Some formulas called for crushed malachite or lapis lazuli, not for color this time, but because their symbolic ties to vitality and protection were thought to seep into the skin. It wasn't only women who pursued softness and glow. Men, especially those in high positions, took equal care with their skin. Scribes working under the dim light of oil lamps might oil their faces in the morning. Soldiers anointed themselves to ward off the burning dryness of the desert wind. To be dry and cracked was to look worn, and looking worn was to be closer to death than to life. There was also a spiritual edge to this care. The act of anointing was tied to the divine. Gods were depicted as eternally youthful, their skin perfect, their bodies glowing. To oil oneself was to imitate them, to align mortal flesh with immortal form. In temple rituals, statues of gods were anointed daily with the same fragrant oils used by royalty, as if beauty itself was part of the offering. Of course, beauty had its dangers. Some skin-whitening pastes contained white lead, which could give a pale, even finish and slowly poison the user. Others mixed crocodile dung with fermented milk, a combination that even in ancient times probably made some people wonder if immortality was worth the smell. But the belief was strong. A smooth, glowing complexion was a sign of health, status, and spiritual favor, even if it meant trusting recipes that were equal parts miracle and hazard. Oils and creams were not simply surface treatments. They were a defense against a harsh world, the burning sun, the stinging sand, the slow erosion of time. They carried scent, memory, and meaning. To touch a jar of perfumed oil was to feel a link between body and spirit, between the world of the living and the gods themselves. And so, in Egypt, beauty began not with the mirror but with the hands. The slow smoothing of oil along the skin, the ritual of turning dryness into light, the belief that to shine was not just to be seen, but to be remembered. In the shimmering heat of ancient Egypt, hair was more than just a frame for the face. It was a statement, a status marker, and, at times, a survival tactic. The Nile Valley could be unkind to hair. The sun bleached it, the wind tangled it, and the ever-present dust dulled it into submission. And so the Egyptians did what they always did when nature failed them. They engineered beauty. Contrary to the glossy scenes painted on tomb walls, many Egyptians, especially the wealthy, shaved their heads. Not just men but women too. The reasons were partly practical. Hair attracted lice, trapped sweat, and became a nuisance in the sweltering climate. But there was also an aesthetic logic. A smooth, clean scalp was a blank canvas, ready for adornment, and that's where wigs came in. Egyptian wigs were not afterthoughts. They were masterpieces, crafted from human hair, palm fiber, or a mix of both. They could be long and sleek, tightly braided, or elaborately curled. They were often perfumed, dusted with fragrant powders, and sometimes even fitted with cones of scented wax that would melt slowly over the course of the day, releasing fragrance as the wearer moved. It was equal parts elegance and spectacle. Imagine attending a banquet where everyone's hair was literally melting perfume into the air. For the elite, wigs were tailored to occasion and mood. Formal styles might cascade in perfect symmetry down the shoulders, framing the face like the statues of gods. Casual ones, if such a thing existed in elite circles, might be shorter with looser curls, signaling a day without court audiences or temple duties. Hair color could be altered with henna or vegetable dyes, while some wigs incorporated gold threads, beads, or semi-precious stones woven directly into the braids. But hair was also political. The type and style of wig could declare your position in society as clearly as a title or a seal. Royal wigs tended toward the iconic, broad, angular cuts that echoed the headdresses of gods, deliberately blurring the line between mortal and divine. Priests often kept their scalps completely bare, signaling purity and devotion. Foreigners in Egyptian art were sometimes shown with distinct hairstyles, a subtle reminder that hair could divide as much as unite. Even children were pulled into the culture of hair symbolism. The sidelock of youth, a single braided lock worn by royal children, was a visible declaration of status and lineage. When that lock was cut, it was more than a haircut. It was a rite of passage, a shift from childhood into the intricate machinery of adult Egyptian life. Hair care itself was its own art. Those who kept their natural hair used combs carved from bone or ivory, and oils infused with castor or almond to keep it supple. Barbers existed, though for the wealthy, hair maintenance was often handled privately within the household by servants skilled in cutting, oiling, and braiding. The poor, meanwhile, kept their hair simpler, sometimes cropped short, sometimes covered with cloth wraps to protect it from the elements. And, of course, there were the extremes. Some recipes promised to cure baldness by rubbing a mixture of fats from various animals, lion, hippopotamus, crocodile, directly onto the scalp. Others suggested boiling porcupine quills in oil and applying the result. Whether these worked or simply made the user smell like the Nile's most unpredictable creatures is another matter entirely. But whether bald by choice or by biology, the Egyptians had mastered the art of controlling the narrative of hair. To wear a wig was not to hide. It was to declare a version of oneself that could be carefully constructed, fragranced, and set in place like a crown. It was beauty in its most deliberate form, and in Egypt, deliberate beauty was the truest kind of power. In the ancient Egyptian world, to smell divine was not a metaphor, it was an expectation. The air in temples, palaces, and even in private homes was heavy with perfume, not merely to please the senses but to proclaim status, health, and spiritual purity. In a civilization that believed the gods themselves could be coaxed with offerings of scent, fragrance became as much a political tool as a cosmetic one. Perfume in Egypt was rarely a quick splash from a bottle. It was a craft, a ceremony, and often a secret recipe guarded within temple walls. Ingredients came from the length and breadth of the known world. Myrrh from Punt, cinnamon from distant Asia, frankincense from Arabia, lotus flowers from the Nile marshes. These ingredients were precious, so precious that the trade routes that carried them were defended like the borders of the kingdom itself. The making of perfume was slow and deliberate. Oils were extracted from plants, then blended with resins, spices, and sometimes wine or honey to deepen the scent and help it cling to the skin. Some mixtures were thick and unguent-like, stored in alabaster jars that kept them cool in the heat. Others were lighter, meant to be dabbed on hair, wigs, or clothing. The most famous Egyptian perfume was kifi, a rich, complex blend of over a dozen ingredients, including honey, wine, raisins, cinnamon, and frankincense. Its scent was deep, smoky, and sweet, said to soothe the soul, promote good dreams, and purify the spirit. Priests burned kifi as incense during rituals, while the wealthy applied it to their bodies before sleep. Imagine drifting into dreams surrounded by the same scent used to commune with the gods, luxury and piety in one breath. Perfume was more than personal indulgence. It was a weapon of seduction, a symbol of holiness, and, in certain cases, a political statement. Cleopatra herself is said to have greeted foreign dignitaries in rooms so saturated with perfume that the scent lingered on their clothes for days. This was not subtle, it was olfactory diplomacy, a way of ensuring that Egypt left an impression even after the meeting was over. The use of perfume was not limited to the elite, though the quality of ingredients often was. Common Egyptians might use locally available herbs and flowers, crushed mint, marjoram, or blue lotus, mixed with animal fat to create a simple fragrance. It was not as elaborate as kifi, but in a hot climate, even a modest scent could be a small luxury and a shield against the less pleasant smells of daily life. Perfume also had a darker, more practical role. It masked decay. In funeral rites, perfumes and incense were burned not only as offerings to the gods but to cloak the scent of mummification. The dead, wrapped in linens infused with oils, were surrounded by fragrance as a final mark of honor. To smell sweet in the afterlife was as important as to look beautiful in it. And then there was the wax perfume cone, one of the stranger hallmarks of Egyptian beauty. Artists depict guests at banquets wearing small, rounded cones atop their wigs. These cones, made of scented wax and oil, slowly melted over the course of the evening, releasing fragrance and coating the hair with shine. It was equal parts cosmetic and theatrical effect, the Egyptian equivalent of wearing your perfume in plain sight. For the Egyptians, perfume was never just a scent. It was an invisible garment, a mark of civilization, and a whisper to the divine. To walk through Thebes or Memphis and leave a trail of lotus and myrrh in your wake was to declare yourself as someone above the ordinary, someone touched, perhaps, by the gods themselves. In the silent, painted stares of ancient Egyptian art, the eyes do most of the speaking. Wide, elongated, framed in bold black lines, they look not just at you, but through you, as if holding some eternal knowledge. This was not an accident of style. In ancient Egypt, the eyes were a canvas of power, beauty, and protection, and no face, whether of a farmer or a pharaoh, was complete without the ritual of kohl. Kohl was more than makeup, it was a shield. Made from ground galena, a lead-based mineral, mixed with oils or fats, it created the iconic black lines that swept outward from the corners of the eye, extending like the wings of the falcon god Horus. The look was timeless, equal parts intimidation, allure, and spiritual armor. Egyptians believed kohl not only enhanced the beauty of the eye but also protected it from the sun's glare, much like primitive sunglasses, and from the malevolent force of the evil eye. The process of making kohl was an art in itself. Galena had to be crushed into a fine powder, then blended with animal fat, beeswax, or vegetable oils to create a smooth paste. Green pigments were also common. Malachite, a copper ore, was ground and mixed into a vivid shade that symbolized rebirth and vitality. These pigments weren't just for the living, they were painted onto the faces of the dead, ensuring that the journey into the afterlife was made with beauty intact. Every class in Egypt wore kohl, though the quality and tools differed. The wealthy stored theirs in elegant alabaster jars or intricately carved wooden containers, often with tiny ivory applicators that slid neatly into a loop on the side. The poor might have theirs in simple clay pots, with sticks or reeds as applicators. But rich or poor, the gesture was the same. A careful sweep along the eyelid, a steady hand tracing a line that connected them not only to fashion but to centuries of tradition. Kohl was not without its hazards. Modern science tells us that lead-based cosmetics are toxic, yet paradoxically, the Egyptians may have stumbled upon a health benefit. Studies have shown that certain compounds in galena stimulated the production of nitric oxide in the skin, which could help fend off infections. Whether by accident or intuition, they had created a beauty ritual that doubled as medicine. But practicality aside, the eyes in ancient Egypt were about performance, the quiet power of a glance. In religious iconography, the eye of Horus symbolized protection, health, and restoration, and kohl-lined eyes were a living echo of that divine emblem. A noblewoman entering a banquet with her gaze perfectly framed was not simply dressed for the evening. She was armored in beauty and symbolism. A soldier riding into battle might wear the same lines, not for vanity, but to invoke the falcon god's watchful gaze. Even children were adorned with kohl, sometimes in thick circles that gave them a solemn, almost otherworldly look. For them, it was believed to offer spiritual protection. For adults, it was both shield and invitation, a way to declare status, health, and charm without uttering a single word. And so, in the bright courtyards of Thebes, in the shadowed halls of Karnak, and on the banks of the Nile where fishermen pulled their catch, you would see eyes outlined in black or green, catching the light like polished stones. The gaze was everything, seductive, sacred, and sharp enough to cut through time. Because in ancient Egypt, beauty didn't just rest on the skin. It lived in the eyes, and those who could master the art of the gaze could master the world. In the sun-bleached land of the Nile, hair was less about what you were born with and more about what you could afford. The desert heat, the dust, and the constant threat of lice made natural hair more trouble than it was worth, so the ancient Egyptians simply opted out. Most shaved their heads. The wealthy shaved for luxury, the poor for necessity. Smooth scalps were cleaner, cooler, and easier to maintain. But baldness was not a fashion statement, it was a blank canvas. Onto that canvas they placed wigs, and not the flat, lifeless wigs of cheap costume shops, but towering constructions of human hair, sheep's wool, or plant fibers, meticulously braided, layered, and perfumed. The most luxurious wigs could weigh several pounds and were often crafted in elaborate styles that announced not only wealth but influence. A noblewoman might wear hers in thick rows of curls, accented with gold beads or lapis lazuli ornaments that caught the light like tiny stars. For men, wigs were equally important. Priests, scribes, and officials often wore short, rounded wigs that framed the face neatly, a style that spoke of order and discipline. Warriors sometimes favored longer wigs for ceremonies, their hairpieces swaying with each deliberate step, more lion's mane than human hair. The choice of wig was as calculated as the choice of clothing. Formal occasions called for formal hair, elaborate, heavily scented constructions that could survive a long banquet under oil lamps. Day-to-day affairs allowed for lighter, more breathable pieces. The wealthy often owned multiple wigs, stored in carved boxes lined with linen, treated with beeswax and aromatic oils to keep them fresh. Servants or slaves were tasked with maintaining them, washing and rescenting each strand to ensure it was ready at a moment's notice. Perfume played an important role here. A wig was not only seen but smelled. Thick cones of scented wax were sometimes pinned atop wigs during festivals or banquets, slowly melting in the heat, releasing waves of fragrance. These cones could be infused with myrrh, cinnamon, or lotus oil, the scent mingling with the air, announcing the wearer before they even arrived. Wigs also carried social messages. To appear in public without one, especially in the higher classes, was to appear unfinished, undressed, perhaps even indecent. They blurred the lines between male and female fashion. Both genders wore them proudly, with differences in style more about function than propriety. In portraits, pharaohs are often shown wearing the Nemes headdress, but in real life, ceremonial wigs could be just as symbolic, signaling divine favor or royal power. Not all wigs were permanent fixtures. Some were worn for festivals and then set aside, replaced by simpler head coverings. But when a wig was donned, it was transformative. A woman could go from a modest, linen-clad figure to a living statue of opulence in moments, her head crowned in black braids glistening with gold. A man could shed his bald, sunburned scalp for a thick mane that spoke of vitality and command. Even in death, wigs had their place. Mummies were sometimes buried with hairpieces, ensuring that, in the afterlife, one's appearance remained as dignified and well-kept as in life. Beauty, after all, was not bound by mortality. It is telling that in a civilization obsessed with eternal images, carved reliefs, painted tombs, statues meant to outlast centuries, the hair was as carefully considered as the face. The wig was more than ornament. It was identity, protection, and performance all in one. And when you walked into a crowded hall in Thebes with a perfectly braided, perfumed masterpiece perched on your head, you were not merely part of the gathering, you were the center of it. In ancient Egypt, you could introduce yourself without saying a word, your scent did it for you. In a land where heat pressed in from all sides and the desert wind could carry the odors of sweat, smoke, and animals, to smell good was not simply a matter of courtesy. It was a declaration of refinement, power, and, at times, divine favor. The most distinctive emblem of this fragrant culture was the perfume cone. Painted again and again in banquet scenes, these curious little sculptures sat like crowns on the heads of both men and women. They were made from fat or beeswax infused with precious oils, blue lotus, myrrh, cinnamon, frankincense, pressed into a smooth cone. At gatherings, as the evening grew warm, the cones would slowly melt, sending a steady trickle of fragrance down through hair and onto clothing. To modern eyes, the concept sounds strange, voluntarily wearing something that would drip over you as the night went on. But in Egypt, the melting was intentional. The hotter the air, the more the scent blossomed. The guests would be bathed in a cloud of perfume, mingling with the aroma of roasted meats, wine, and temple incense. The cone was both adornment and atmosphere, a way to be the center of attention without speaking. Perfume, however, was not merely for seduction or vanity. It was sacred. Certain blends were created specifically for temple use, guarded recipes passed down among priests, who would anoint statues and altars as part of daily worship. These scents were considered offerings in their own right, as pleasing to the gods as gold or lapis lazuli. To appear before a deity without proper fragrance was almost as unthinkable as arriving in soiled clothes. For the everyday person, perfume might be as simple as rubbing the skin with castor oil or crushed herbs to keep it supple and faintly fragrant. But the wealthy commissioned complex blends, sourcing ingredients from far beyond Egypt's borders: cinnamon from India, frankincense from Punt, rare resins from the Levant. These imports were expensive, and to wear them was a public sign of wealth. Men embraced perfume as eagerly as women. Pharaohs were described as smelling of sacred oils daily, each fragrance chosen for a specific mood or purpose: diplomacy, battle, religious ceremony. In this sense, perfume was almost like an invisible costume, signaling your role in that moment. The perfume industry was a thriving part of Egypt's economy. Oils and scented resins were traded across the Mediterranean, and Egyptian recipes survived long enough to influence Greek and Roman perfumers centuries later. The names of the blends were as poetic as the scents themselves: breath of lotus at dawn, the myrrh of the rising sun, the oil of 1,000 blossoms. But the art of scent had its hazards. Some perfumes were so resin-heavy they irritated the skin or stained fabrics. Others attracted swarms of flies rather than admirers. Yet the risks rarely deterred anyone. In Egypt, smelling like a blooming garden in the heart of the desert was worth a few inconveniences. Ultimately, fragrance in Egypt was about more than smelling pleasant. It was about commanding a space before you even entered it, about pleasing gods and people alike, about carrying an aura that spoke of wealth, devotion, or desire. In a civilization obsessed with harmony and order, the right scent didn't just enhance beauty, it completed it. In the shimmering light of the Nile Valley, beauty and health were not separate pursuits. They were bound together, painted on the same face. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the Egyptians' devotion to eye cosmetics, where looking striking and warding off disease came from the same small pot of powder. The most iconic of these was kohl, a dark, silky paste that defined the Egyptian gaze for thousands of years. Both men and women wore it, tracing their eyes in bold, almond-shaped lines that seemed to hold an entire desert's worth of mystery. To us, it might seem like pure decoration, but in Egypt, kohl was also medicine. Crafted from galena, a naturally occurring lead sulfide, kohl had antibacterial properties that helped prevent and treat eye infections, a common threat in a land of sun glare, dust storms, and Nile-borne parasites. Mixed with fats or plant oils, it formed a smooth, long-lasting paste that clung to the skin even in the midday heat. The kohl acted like a primitive sunscreen for the eyes, reducing glare from the sun's white-hot reflection off the river. Green malachite, another favorite, was ground to a fine powder and applied to the lids or under the eyes. While its bold emerald tone was certainly fashionable, it also contained copper compounds that had mild germicidal effects. In other words, the green wasn't just for envy, it was for immunity. The act of applying these pigments carried both ritual and social weight. In temple reliefs, even gods and goddesses are shown with heavily lined eyes, reinforcing the idea that to wear kohl was to participate in divine order. Children had their eyes painted from an early age, not only for protection but as a sign of care and belonging. For the wealthy, kohl was stored in beautifully carved containers, alabaster jars, inlaid wooden boxes, or tubular applicators made from bone and ivory. These containers were works of art in themselves, often buried with their owners, so that beauty could follow them into the afterlife. The applicators, dipped into the kohl and drawn across the lids, were as much tools of health as they were instruments of style. Even the preparation of kohl was part science, part alchemy. Ingredients were ground on polished stone pallets, sifted to achieve a perfect texture, and sometimes mixed with exotic imports like frankincense or crushed pearls. The best blends had a scent as well as a color, creating an experience that appealed to sight, smell, and touch all at once. This blending of beauty and medicine was not accidental. It was a reflection of the Egyptian worldview. The body was a sacred vessel, and caring for it meant pleasing the gods, protecting health, and maintaining social grace all at once. A painted eye was not vanity, it was wisdom. To look into the eyes of an ancient Egyptian was to see more than style. It was to see centuries of accumulated knowledge, passed down through hands that knew how to crush stone into safety, how to turn pigment into protection. And, perhaps most importantly, it was to glimpse a civilization that understood that beauty, when worn wisely, could be a shield as much as a statement. In ancient Egypt, hair was never just hair. It was a language, a quiet, elaborate code of status, age, and identity. And like any good language, it could be rewritten, rearranged, and, if necessary, entirely replaced. The wig was not an accessory. it was a performance. Whether you were a nobleman attending a temple festival or a woman presiding over a household, the right wig could speak volumes before you ever opened your mouth. Natural hair was often shaved or cut very short, particularly in the heat of the summer months. This wasn't only for comfort, it was practical. A shaved head kept lice at bay and made it easier to maintain personal hygiene in a climate that could turn hair into a dust-trapping nuisance. The wig then became a kind of removable crown, easy to put on for formal occasions, easy to remove for cleanliness. The materials were as telling as the style. Wigs for the wealthy were made from human hair, sometimes their own, sometimes bought, sometimes taken as tribute from abroad. Cheaper versions might use plant fibers, sheep's wool, or palm leaf strips, skillfully dyed to imitate human hair. The craftsmanship was meticulous. Strands were sewn into fine netting or woven into braids, then fixed into the desired shape with beeswax or resin. Styles ranged from heavy, shoulder-length bob cuts to intricate layers of tight curls or cascading braids. Some wigs framed the face like a sculpted helmet, while others were decorated with beads, gold wire, or even perfumed cones, allowing them to serve as both ornament and fragrance diffuser. Men's wigs tended to be shorter and simpler, though high officials often favored a thick, squared style that signaled authority. Wigs also aged with their owners, not because the wigs themselves changed, but because certain styles were associated with life stages. Children often had shaved heads with a single braided sidelock. Adults wore fuller wigs, while older Egyptians sometimes opted for simpler, lighter styles. There was also a theatrical quality to wig wearing. Slaves and servants often went bareheaded or wore simple kerchiefs, while elite Egyptians appeared at banquets with glossy, perfectly symmetrical wigs that caught the lamplight as they moved. Removing the wig could strip away not only the heat of the day but also the performance of rank, a reminder that much of beauty in Egypt was, quite literally, a costume. Even in death, wigs followed their owners. Tomb paintings depict the deceased wearing their finest styles, while actual wigs have been found preserved in burial sites, some still carrying the faint scent of perfumed oil. The afterlife, it seemed, was no place to appear disheveled. There's something almost modern about it, the idea of hair as both identity and illusion. Just as we might dye, curl, or straighten today, Egyptians reshaped their public selves one braid at a time. In the end, the wig was more than a vanity, it was a tool, a shield against the sun, a weapon in the unspoken battle of appearances. And perhaps, most importantly, a reminder that in ancient Egypt, beauty was not simply what you were born with, it was what you chose to create. In the heat of the Egyptian sun, where dust clung to skin and the air itself seemed to shimmer, beauty began not with makeup or jewels, but with the cleansing of the body. Hygiene was not just a matter of comfort. It was a statement of refinement, health, and, for the upper classes, divine favor. Contrary to some romantic visions, there were no marble baths like in Rome, no endless flow of steaming water. Bathing in Egypt was a simpler, more deliberate affair. For most people, washing meant using a basin, a jug of water, and perhaps a woven cloth or sponge made from reeds. For the wealthy, however, bathing was ritualized. Servants might pour cool water scented with petals or herbs over the bather, allowing the runoff to carry away sweat, dust, and the faint metallic tang of coal. Soaps, in the modern sense, didn't exist, but cleansing agents did. A paste made from natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, was often used for its abrasive, deodorizing qualities. Natron was the same material used in mummification, which meant it was both deeply practical and faintly unsettling. Other cleansers might include clay mixed with oil, or crushed lotus seeds for a gentle scrub. Once clean, the real work of beauty began, oiling the skin. In a climate where the sun burned and the air wicked away moisture, oils were essential. Olive oil, castor oil, and morina oil were common, often blended with fragrant additives like cinnamon, myrrh, or lotus. These oils didn't just soften the skin, they acted as a protective barrier, locking in moisture and shielding the body from the harsh glare of the sun. Perfume was the final, invisible layer, the scented armor of the elite. Egyptian perfumers were both artisans and chemists, skilled in extracting fragrance from flowers, herbs, and resins. They used labor-intensive methods like maceration, soaking plant materials in oil for days or weeks until the essence was fully absorbed. The resulting perfumes could be thick, almost syrupy, meant to be dabbed at the wrists or hairline rather than splashed on. The famous perfume cones, seen in Egyptian art, those strange, rounded shapes perched on the heads of banquet guests, were likely made from fat infused with fragrance. As the cones slowly melted in the heat, It released scent and perhaps added a subtle sheen to the hair or wig beneath. It was both functional and theatrical, a visible signal that one was not just attending an event, but fully inhabiting it. Scent had meaning beyond the social. Certain aromas were believed to please the gods or ward off evil. Myrrh and frankincense, for instance, were not just luxury imports from the lands to the south and east. They were offerings in temples, their smoke carrying prayers upward. To wear them was to carry a piece of the divine on one's skin. This layering of cleanliness, oil, and scent was more than indulgence. It was self-preservation, social strategy, and spiritual practice all at once. In Egypt, beauty could be seen, in the gloss of oiled skin, in the perfect coil of a braid, but it could also be smelled, lingering in the air after a person had passed, as much a signature as their face. The irony is that much of this ritual belonged only to those who could afford the time and materials. For the common farmer or craftsman, washing in the Nile, rubbing on whatever oil could be spared, and hoping the wind carried away the smell of the day was luxury enough. But for the elite, bathing was not just maintenance, it was transformation. And transformation, as always, was the essence of Egyptian beauty. In ancient Egypt, jewelry was not merely decoration. It was protection, proclamation, and, in many ways, a kind of portable identity. A single necklace could announce your wealth, whisper your devotion to a deity, and silently ward off danger, all before you spoke a word. Gold was the undisputed queen of materials. The Egyptians called it the flesh of the gods, a metal that never tarnished and therefore symbolized eternity. Mines in Nubia supplied a steady stream of gold, which was hammered, cast, and worked into everything from delicate earrings to massive pectoral collars that covered the chest and shoulders like a gleaming second skin. For the wealthy, gold was more than a status symbol. It was a direct link to the divine, a wearable claim to immortality. But beauty in Egypt was rarely about a single material. Semi-precious stones brought their own meanings and powers. Turquoise, the joy of the goddess Hathor, was thought to bring happiness and protect against evil. Carnelian glowed with the life-giving color of the sun, while lapis lazuli, imported from distant Afghanistan, was associated with the heavens themselves. Even humble faience, a glazed ceramic in bright blue or green, shimmered with a beauty meant to echo the Nile's life-giving waters. The designs were layered with meaning. Scarab beetles, symbols of rebirth, were carved into rings and amulets. The Eye of Horus, representing protection and healing, appeared on bracelets and pendants. Lotus flowers, closing at night and blooming again at dawn, became metaphors for renewal, worn as earrings or woven into headdresses. Men and women alike adorned themselves. A laborer might own a simple faience bead bracelet. A nobleman might wear a broad collar inlaid with gold and semi-precious stones. Even children wore protective amulets to guard against illness or bad fortune. Jewelry was democratic in that way, not in cost but in purpose. Everyone believed in its power, even if their own pieces were made from humble materials. At banquets, jewelry was as much performance as attire. Gold collars caught the flicker of oil lamps, reflecting light upward to the face. Rings clinked gently against wine cups. Anklets chimed faintly with movement, an intimate sound meant for the immediate company. This was jewelry as social theater, where every gem was a line of unspoken dialogue. In life, jewelry signified wealth, faith, and personal taste. In death, it was insurance. Tombs were stocked with jewelry to accompany the dead into the afterlife, not simply to beautify them, but to protect them in the perilous journey beyond. Some pieces were even inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead, ensuring that the wearer's spirit could pass safely through the trials that awaited. There was also a subtle politics to jewelry. Who could wear certain materials and in what combinations was not entirely freeform. The most extravagant designs were reserved for royalty or the highest officials. To wear beyond your station was a risk. Beauty, in Egypt, was always balanced with the awareness of one's place in the grand order of things. Perhaps the most telling truth about Egyptian jewelry is that it was never just beautiful. Every bead, every clasp, every engraved symbol had a purpose: to protect, to declare, to connect the wearer to something larger than themselves. And in a culture where death was only another stage of existence, beauty was not fleeting. It was eternal. Before the first brush stroke touched the skin, before kohl traced its dark and steady line, there was the palette, an object as symbolic as it was practical. In ancient Egypt, a cosmetic palette was not just a tool. It was a statement of refinement, an artifact of daily life elevated to artistry. The earliest palettes were simple, flat stones with a shallow depression for grinding pigments. But as centuries passed, they evolved into highly decorated pieces carved from slate, schist, or alabaster. Some were shaped like animals or adorned with hieroglyphic inscriptions. Others bore scenes of hunting, ritual, or myth, small worlds etched into the surface where beauty began each morning. Pigments were ground with slow, deliberate motions using a small stone pestle. Malachite produced a green that called to mind the fertile banks of the Nile. Galena yielded the rich black coal that became the defining feature of Egyptian eyes. Red ochre, sourced from the desert, offered warmth for lips and cheeks. Each color came not just with a hue, but with an association, protection, vitality, divine favor. The palette was, in many ways, a private altar. Even in modest homes, a small slab might be kept alongside a mirror of polished copper or bronze. For the wealthy, palettes could be as elaborate as jewelry, inlaid with gold, silver, or mother of pearl, stored in decorated boxes of cedar or ivory. They were personal treasures, yet also shared in moments of social grooming, when beauty was a communal act. Applying cosmetics was not done in haste. Kohl, for example, was mixed with fat or oil to help it adhere and to keep it from smudging in the heat. The applicator, often a slender stick of wood, ivory, or metal, was dipped into the pigment, then drawn along the eyelids with a steady hand. Mirrors, though small, reflected enough to ensure symmetry. The process could take minutes or longer, depending on the level of detail desired. And there was more than vanity at play. The dark rim of kohl was believed to shield the eyes from the sun's glare and, more importantly, to ward off disease. The green of malachite was associated with the gods, thought to call down their favor. Rouge, too, was not simply for warmth of color. It was an emblem of life itself. For the elite, makeup artistry could be almost ceremonial. Servants might prepare pigments in advance, grinding and blending under the watchful eye of their mistress. A wealthy man might sit for his own application of kohl before attending a public event, his eyes sharpened, his appearance carefully curated to project health, status, and power. In tombs, cosmetic palettes were placed beside the dead, often with small jars of pigment, a sign that beauty was not abandoned in death. In the afterlife, one would still rise each day, and to face the gods, one must be properly adorned. The irony, perhaps, is that while these tools and pigments were so carefully crafted, their results, the painted face, the perfect line, lasted only hours before heat, dust, and the sweat of the Nile erased them. Yet each day the ritual began anew, as if impermanence itself was part of the magic. Beauty was not meant to last forever. It was meant to be practiced again and again like a prayer. In ancient Egypt, hair was never just hair. It was identity, status, and, quite often, a carefully maintained illusion. While paintings and carvings may leave the impression that every Egyptian had thick, perfect locks, the truth is more complex and more inventive. For the elite, wigs were as essential as jewelry. They were not costume pieces but daily attire, designed to impress and to signal one's place in society. Made from human hair, plant fibers, or a mixture of both, these wigs were works of meticulous craftsmanship. Each strand was knotted or woven into a mesh cap, the whole structure lacquered or oiled to keep it smooth and lustrous under the harsh Egyptian sun. There was practicality behind the artifice. The heat and dust of the Nile Valley made maintaining natural hair difficult. Lice were a constant nuisance. Many Egyptians, especially the wealthy, shaved their heads entirely for hygiene, then wore wigs for style and status. This not only solved the pest problem but also allowed for elaborate shapes and designs that natural hair could rarely hold. The designs themselves followed fashion trends that could last decades or shift with the reign of a new pharaoh. Short, bobbed wigs framed the face in the Old Kingdom, while the New Kingdom saw the rise of long, layered styles, often braided and sometimes adorned with beads, gold wire, or even perfumed cones of scented wax. At banquets, these wax cones would slowly melt, releasing fragrance into the hair and air alike, a mingling of beauty and indulgence that left an impression long after the evening ended. Not all wigs were equal. The finest were made from imported human hair, costly and labor-intensive to acquire. Others used palm fibers or wool, dyed black to mimic the desired sheen. Servants and commoners might wear simpler versions, or none at all, tying their hair back or covering it with linen scarves. But even among the lower classes, special occasions could call for rented wigs, a fleeting chance to step into the glamour of the upper world. Men, too, embraced the wig. A nobleman might choose a short, curled style for formal settings or a longer, straighter design for ceremonies. Priests, who shaved their bodies for ritual purity, sometimes wore wigs to distinguish formal occasions from the austerity of temple life. Soldiers, however, often wore their natural hair short for practicality in the field. Wigs were not just fashion, they were political statements. The way a person wore their hair could signal loyalty to a ruler, adherence to tradition, or a deliberate break from the old in favor of the new. Foreign influence also crept in. During periods of trade or conquest, Egyptian styles might incorporate elements from Nubia or the Levant, blending aesthetics into something distinctly yet subtly different. Hair oils and perfumes completed the ritual. Castor oil, palm oil, and animal fats kept both wigs and natural hair supple. Scent was a language of its own. A perfumed head could announce one's arrival before a word was spoken. To appear in public with dry, unkempt hair was to risk being read as careless, impoverished, or even disrespectful. In the tomb, wigs held the same symbolic weight as in life. They were placed alongside the dead as part of the full regalia required for the afterlife, because even in the presence of the gods, appearance mattered. To be reborn meant to be reborn at one's best. Perhaps the greatest irony is that the hair seen in so many surviving statues and paintings was often never attached to the head it adorned. It was art layered over absence, a deliberate illusion. And in that, it reflected much of Egyptian beauty itself, carefully constructed, deeply symbolic, and meant to project an image that might be more powerful than reality. If the eyes were the poetry of Egyptian beauty, scent was the music, invisible yet unforgettable. In the ancient Nile Valley, to be beautiful was not simply to be seen. It was to be experienced, surrounded by an aura of fragrance that marked wealth, refinement, and sometimes even divinity. Perfume was not a finishing touch. It was a central element of daily life, embedded in ritual, romance, and religion. Oils and unguents, thick with exotic resins and spices, were stored in delicate alabaster jars, faience bottles, and intricately carved stone vessels. To open one was to release a cloud of centuries-old luxury. Myrrh from Punt, cinnamon from distant lands, lotus essence pressed from blossoms that floated in temple pools. These were not cheap indulgences. Many ingredients had to be imported through trade routes stretching into Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and beyond. Myrrh, frankincense, and cassia traveled across deserts and seas, arriving in Egypt as treasures more valuable than gold by weight. To own them was to hold the scent of foreign kingdoms in your hands. Fragrance was layered with purpose. Before applying perfume, the skin was massaged with base oils, often castor, morina, or bolanos, which kept it soft and acted as a fixative, holding the scent longer in the heat. The wealthy could afford daily anointing, sometimes with the help of servants trained in the art of perfuming the body so evenly that no inch of skin was left untouched. Banquets were olfactory spectacles. Guests might arrive wearing perfumed wigs, their cones of scented wax slowly melting into the hair, releasing fragrance throughout the evening. The air would be thick with incense from braziers, mingling with the aromas of roasted meats, spiced wines, and the floral notes clinging to the garments of those in attendance. It was beauty as atmosphere, an immersive performance. Perfume also had a sacred dimension. Temples used massive quantities of incense and oils in daily offerings to the gods. The kifi, a famous temple perfume, was a complex blend of honey, wine, raisins, myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, and other botanicals. It was burned as incense or applied to statues of deities, the rising smoke believed to carry prayers to the heavens. In this way, to anoint oneself was to participate in a ritual language spoken by both mortals and gods. There was also seduction in scent. Love poems from the New Kingdom speak of lovers longing for the smell of each other's hair, of lotus flowers twined around the neck, of bodies sweet as myrrh. Fragrance was not neutral. It was charged, magnetic, a tool of attraction as powerful as any painted eye or jeweled necklace. Even the dead were not denied perfume. In burial rites, bodies were anointed with oils to prepare them for eternity. Jars of unguents were placed in tombs so that the deceased might greet the gods not just with the proper garments, but with the proper fragrance, an olfactory calling card to the divine. And yet, this olfactory culture was not without irony. In a land where daily laborers sweated under a merciless sun, where the scent of fish markets and livestock drifted along city streets, perfume was both a luxury and a mask. For the elite, it separated the refined from the ordinary. For everyone else, it was an aspiration, a reminder of a world just out of reach, where every movement left a trail of fragrance in the air. The Egyptians understood something modern perfumers still chase. Scent can make memory immortal. The aroma of blue lotus or warm myrrh was more than pleasant. It was a trigger, calling to mind nights under flickering lamplight, temple processions at dawn, or the presence of someone unforgettable. To smell it again was to relive the moment entirely. The beauty rituals of ancient Egypt did not vanish when the last pharaoh's tomb was sealed. They seeped forward, carried on the papyrus scrolls of physicians, the travel journals of merchants, and the half-remembered stories of those who had once walked the banks of the Nile. What survives in museums today, a carved coal pot, a fragment of a wig, a jar still faintly smelling of resin, is not just evidence of vanity, but proof of a worldview. For the Egyptians, beauty was never superficial. It was harmony, it was health, it was order drawn onto the canvas of the body in the same way the gods had drawn the order of the universe. Kohl-lined eyes did not simply please the beholder, they warded off glare and infection. Perfumed oils did not merely announce wealth, they preserved skin against the desert's cruelty. Wigs and jewelry were not decoration alone, they signaled status, loyalty, and place within a carefully arranged society. And so, beauty was a language, one spoken in pigments and patterns, in scents and textures, in the glint of gold against sun-darkened skin. To be silent in that language was to risk being invisible. To speak it fluently was to claim one's space in life and, importantly, in death. For the afterlife was the ultimate audience. The cosmetics, wigs, and perfumes buried with the dead were not tokens of nostalgia but tools for eternity. A soul might need its best face when stepping into the hall of judgment, might require the scent of blue lotus to greet Osiris, might wish to glide into the field of reeds exactly as one had appeared at one's most radiant moment in life. In the Egyptian mind, immortality was not just about the soul, it was about the self, preserved in every sensual detail. We like to imagine that vanity is a modern obsession, born of mirrors, photography, and advertising. But the truth is older and deeper. In ancient Egypt, beauty was a duty. A face painted with care was a sign of respect for oneself, for the gods, and for the order of the world. Neglect was not freedom, it was disorder, and disorder was the enemy of life itself. Even now, echoes of their rituals persist. Modern eyeliners trace the same lines they once drew. Spa treatments still promise the youthful skin their oils protected. Perfumes bear notes of frankincense, myrrh, and lotus, the same scents that drifted through palace halls and temple courts thousands of years ago. Each small act of adornment carries the faint shadow of the Nile. Perhaps that is the real legacy of Egyptian beauty, the quiet reminder that caring for the body is also caring for the spirit, that a jar of oil, a stroke of pigment, or a wreath of flowers can be more than an aesthetic choice. It can be a way of placing oneself in harmony with the world, of standing before life and death as the best version of oneself. And somewhere, in the imagined golden light of the ancient river, we can still see them, women and men beneath the shade of palm trees, servants pouring fragrant oil into their palms, artists grinding malachite on smooth stones, laughter mingling with the warm air, a civilization speaking in the soft language of beauty, believing, perhaps rightly, that if you could hold the sun in a jar, wear the earth's colors on your face, and carry the scent of the gods on your skin, you could keep the chaos at bay, for a day or forever.